Hello, folks. There he is. Excellent.
Hello.
Welcome, folks. Welcome to another edition of Safe Space for White Questions. My name is Alex Khasnabish. I am here with my partner in crime, Ajay Parasram. I'm going to throw it over to AJ in a second just to let him say hello. But we are back on Instagram, of course, here with you on our new platforms live here. Welcome back. If it's your first time, welcome to our live digital forum for all your questions relating to anti-racism and social justice. My name is Alex Khasnabish. As I said before, I'm coming to you from unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory, from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I sell my labor for a wage at the university as a professor there. Back with you as one of your two co-hosts here, and we're eager to get to your questions. Just going to throw it over to AJ to say hello, and then we'll get right to it.
Hey everyone, I'm Ajay Parasram. I also sell my labor for a wage here on the peninsula, Dalhousie University. And yeah, I think Alex pretty much said it all. We're going to do what we always do and jump right into your questions. We have a few in the queue, so go ahead, Alex.
All right. Of course, sorry, folks. One thing I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge and shout out our wonderful friends at Fernwood Publishing who support Bottom Line this project. Thank them for all their logistics and advertising support and in general putting up with us. All right, so right to your questions. The first one is a bit of a long one, I admit, given our practice here. As those of you who are returning viewers know that we don't look at your questions in advance. So I'm sorry to say that I'm going to read most of this one, even though it's a bit long because I did not have a chance to summarize. So here we go. This question is about professional sports and race, particularly African heritage folks. American football has been my thrust for being concerned about this area of life. Though issues of exploitation of athletes happen in all professional sports and in college sports, though not considered professional, do rise to that level of spotlight, especially in the U.S. There's a well-known risk of violence and brutality in football, and the science behind the risks of repeated concussions. When advocating that violent sports like football or boxing or UFC, MMA, right, are justifiable, I most often hear the argument that athletes are making free choices to participate. In philosophical terms, this seems like a dead choice, no pun intended. If you're marginalized, racialized, such as African American people, where economic struggles are a day-to-day reality, then the hope that your physical abilities could bring to you millions of dollars to support yourself and your family is worth many short-term and long-term physical risks. I'm wanting to frame this in a racial light. However, for anyone participating in football, boxing, etc., there's a level of barbarism and toxic aggressive behaviors that seems so frustrating to still see celebrated in 2023. There's the element of the fall of empires through the focus of entertainment thrown in there as well. Not much of a question here, but basically wondering your thoughts on ethical and social issues involved with all professional sports. Thinking of Detroit bankrupt with 4 high-paying pro sports teams, and the violent and toxic promotion of contact sports like football, boxing, and so on. So interesting question. Thanks for that. So the question is basically about the dimensions of risk, physical and otherwise, in violent contact sports like football. I would assume hockey's in there too in some ways, and boxing, MMA. Of course, the racial divisions in terms of who participates in different sports are also clear too, right? So great question. Okay, I'm going to take a run at this first. And as those of you who are longer time viewers know, I've got a bit of a thing for martial arts. And I spend too much time doing jiu-jitsu and grappling with other people. And I'm also a hockey fan, to be totally transparent about all this. So I'm going to come at this a couple of different ways. On the racial issue, I think, yeah, I mean, you bang on in a lot of ways. I think the dynamics between the Canadian context and the American one are important to point out. There's much less money involved, obviously, in Canadian college university sports. That doesn't mean there aren't incentives, issues, and risks involved, scholarships, status, the opportunity to break into pro sports somewhere else. So those dynamics are often replicated at the level of people, as you correctly identify here, right? Like, given the range of options, why are people being kind of funneled? Why are certain kinds of students being funneled into certain kinds of pursuits? And obviously, there's a huge issue in the States. It's been written about really robustly. I'm blanking on the sports writer who's like got a social justice angle. Maybe it'll come to me. Anyway, he writes about this all the time. Talks a lot about sort of the plantation aspect of college sports in the States, right? And this question around whether NCAA athletes get paid for their, because there's so much money involved, right? So I think on the one hand, for me, pro sports is like a workers issue, right? Like, while I think it's kind of grotesque, obviously, that we live in a society where some people get paid so very much for doing something they love and other people have to absolutely scrape and claw to survive. Or if you're talented enough at doing a certain kind of thing, you can live a really privileged life as a result of it. I also recognize that those, if we think of those people as workers in that industry who are generating that wealth, then I don't in principle have a problem with pro athletes actually taking home a big chunk of the revenue generated by their performances. So, when LeBron or when I don't follow football, so honestly, I couldn't even dream up I'd have to talk to my 16-year-old about this. He knows all about that. But Austin Matthews getting a $14 million payday for playing for the Toronto Maple Leafs, right, per year, that sort of thing seems outrageous. I mean, he's a white guy too. Well, Austin Matthews has a racialized background. But again, it's a question of how much money is generated by the spectacle itself. So for me, there's that one issue there. On the other hand, yeah, absolutely. We see the same kinds of dynamics that were generated by historical processes of dispossession and marginalization, funneling people into certain kinds of pursuits, right? So certain things like the military becomes a vehicle for upward mobility for many people who come from low income or racialized backgrounds, precisely because it supports so many of those other opportunities that middle class people already have access to, right? Like education, you get you do your service, then you get opportunities on the other side, you get trained, you can get your degree. So there's all that. And I completely agree with that aspect. I mean, I would say on the other hand, I think for me, I like combat sports. I like watching them too. I'm just going to go on the record as saying that. I don't think we need to patronize people too greatly. I think there is obviously a significant risk of head injury in sports like boxing, MMA, football, hockey. We can't dismiss that. I think there are ways of making those sports obviously safer. As somebody who practices martial arts and has been injured in the past, though happily, knock on wood, never seriously. I think that's a part of living. And that individual choice aspect, I think, maybe that issue I won't address. I think there's a lot of room for people to do what they want consensually, as long as it is indeed consensual. But I do agree that I think the larger dynamics of who plays where, who owns, and this has been written really interestingly about with respect to the NFL, how many black coaches are there, how many black owners, and then how many, the majority of the league is racialized, right? So the NBA, we see the same kinds of dynamics. In hockey, it's quite flipped, right? So those kinds of questions, I think, definitely deserve interrogation. But I mean, yeah, I guess I would just say, as somebody who has an affinity for some of that stuff, I think we can address structural inequality without necessarily dismissing the idea that some people want to do things for the rest kind of bread and circusy otherwise. That's my take. Over to you, AJ.
All right, thanks for that, and thanks for this question. It's I think the first substantive sports question like this that we've gotten in a couple of years of running the show. I don't really have a whole lot to add, in part because I always liked tennis and basketball, and pretty much you never touch the other person. It's never really been an issue for me in the sports that I enjoy. But I think, like, to kind of pick up on the spirit of some of the questions here, I think the question as I read it definitely also speaks to the kind of spectator aspect of the sport. So even not necessarily the people who are engaged in it, that Alex, I think, spoke to, much better than I could, but like rather what's happening to society in the way that we consume athletic events when there may or may not be a constriction of choices. So, I mean, I think in broad strokes, I agree entirely with Alex in terms of, there's enough space for people to do things safely and consensually. But like maybe at this philosophical terms, we should be asking ourselves about, what is it about like the social tendency of wanting to put the gladiators into the gladiator pen and kind of watch it unfold. I mean, I think, I don't know, like I'm not a fighter. I hang out with a lot of people who enjoy that sort of thing. I don't dislike it. So it's not even about liking, but I think it's really about the essence of the question as I read it really speaks more to what is society doing to make sure that people in general are making choices about what they do to earn a living. And I think that's a broader question about basically the fundamental inequalities and inequities of capitalism and the history of capitalism, because most kinds of labor represent relatively constricted choices. And then we can look to these like weird examples of exceptionality, right? For every like, $10 million contract for a competitive athlete, there's probably 10 million people who are pursuing that dream and will never make it. And we exceptionalize the individual as opposed to kind of looking to the broader way that we've kind of chosen to reward society. So not much, it's just kind of thoughts on it, really. I don't have any definitive question for you on that, but yeah, let's move on, Alex.
All right, moving on. Is it anti-Semitic to single out Israel for criticism? I feel really intimidated to say anything at all Israel and Palestine, and I'm against the killing of innocent people everywhere. And I don't understand why a country as militarily powerful as Israel gets a free pass to do anything they want with impunity. So great question. Obviously, very topical right now. Super important. No, I would say, like, as a basic answer, of course, criticism of a nation state and its strategies, policies, legal architecture, all that kind of stuff is fair game. We live in a global community constituted by nation states. That's, the product of the last few hundred years. We all acknowledge more or less that we live in that environment. And those nation states those states themselves are regarded as the kind of the highest manifestation of sovereignty, right? Of like the people and their will over a given territory and all that kind of stuff. So of course we have every right to criticize any country and its policies. Is some criticism of Israel anti-Semitic? Absolutely. Like these dynamics are difficult to parse. In general, I would say that I tend to fall down on being a fairly vigorous defender of the right to criticize nation states and their policies, right? And Israel is somewhat unique, not entirely unique, but somewhat unique in the fact that it is one of those countries where ethnicity, religion, and nationality have been collapsed, right? So homeland for Jewish people, this idea of like Jews everywhere globally having a home in Israel and being entitled to citizenship, obviously the historical product of the partitioning of that area of the Mideast in the 1940s, and the incredible violence, displacement, dispossession meted out against the people living there at the time. But also, like frankly, the fact that Jews had been chased out of Europe and had not found homes as refugees in places like Canada or the United States, had been turned away. So it's like super complicated. What I would say is this, is that I agree with many of my comrades, with some of my comrades on the left who would say that the left has an anti-Semitism problem. I think that's true, actually. And I am troubled by the degree to which sometimes people are willing to single out certain countries or certain kinds of policies as examples of this, and tend to set a higher bar. You know, you might hear the argument sometimes like, oh, given what Jews experienced in World War II or in the Holocaust specifically, right, it's abhorrent that they do to Palestinians. That to me is like an example of an argument that extends that anti-Semitic possibility. It's like, oh, it's way worse for Black people to be racist than for other people because they've experienced this kind of historical violence, and so they should know better. First of all, that like homogenizes and simplifies experience, lived experience across a whole variety of people in incredibly superficial ways. It also reduces or conflates those individuals with the state of Israel. There are lots of Jews who are anti-Zionist. There are lots of Jews who are secular and aren't religious people. There are lots of Jews who are leftists, who are, you know, right-winger. Like all people, we're dealing with like a very diverse and heterogeneous community. And so I think, you know, part of the problem here, like I tell most of my students at the place where I teach, is that we can't have these arguments at the level of kind of political concept and the abstract. What we're dealing with is an incredibly difficult and demanding, complex situation on the ground that involves all kinds of like concrete power dynamics, the application of military force to an incredibly impoverished and constrained and basically imprisoned population, and those are entirely legitimate grounds for criticism. We can also, just like America was criticized in the aftermath of 9/11 and continues to be for its response to the attacks on the World Trade Center, similarly, we can look at what Hamas, you know, like you can do both things. This is what I talk about all the time in terms of maintaining the contradiction. Like we live as humans in a contradictory and complex world. We all know that we think things that we don't always live up to. So we can live in a world where it's perfectly possible to say, and I would agree, I don't know, I'm not speaking for AJ, obviously, that Hamas's attack in Israel on October 7th was an atrocity. Like, I don't think killing civilians is anything less than an atrocity. But I can also agree that that attack was a response to the enduring occupation of Palestinian territory by the Israeli state that refuses to negotiate in good faith towards a two-state or single-state peace accord, to the regularization of Palestinian statehood or identity that has systematically denied the rights of people to democratically chart their own course, all that kind of stuff. So I would rather us sink into that and talk about the dynamics of state building and peace building and what it takes to get there, versus this kind of like moralizing about the imagined positionality of national groups. I guess that's all I would say. So just to reiterate before I pass it over to AJ, no, of course, legitimate and evidence-based criticism of the Israeli state is not anti-Semitic, but much commentary that circulates today is anti-Semitic because anti-Semitism, like other forms of racism, is so entrenched in so many of our discourses, institutions, relationships, unfortunately. Over to you, AJ.
All right. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I have a slightly different take on it. As a scholar of states in particular, that's sort of like what I do most of the time when I'm not talking to you all here, is writing about states and state formation. I mean, the first thing I would say is that countries are not people. Countries will never be people, and countries are always treated as if they are people in the international community. The whole kind of imagination of how the system of states has come to be from the 19th century on to now has been largely this kind of like total fiction that countries are people and they interact like people. So from that basis that countries are not people, I don't think that being critical of Israel really in any way can be anti-Semitism. Being anti-Semitic and being like expressing hatred of Jews as a people and Jews as, you know, as a religion, totally anti-Semitic. It doesn't mean that sometimes when people try to make claims and criticize Israel the way Alex is talking about, that they don't then venture into and overlap with ideas that are sometimes anti-Semitic. But fundamentally, I think it's really important to kind of like look at the history that gives rise to the idea first that we've normalized in places like Canada and the United States in particular, that we should not be critical of Israel and that Israel has a special status. And it has a really recent history. Like, so it arises from the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. That's the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. I think you can look it up. And they have a very particular and stylized definition of what anti-Semitism is. And you can read about it. Independent Jewish Voices and others have written a lot about this. They've proposed alternative, the Jerusalem Declaration, as an alternative framing of what anti-Semitism is to try to deal with this issue of how the IHRA definition conflates the state of Israel and presents Israel as being the sort of quote unquote collective Jew in the international community. Now, in addition to that, under the Harper years here in Canada, there was a parliamentary committee that was struck that was led by a former Liberal cabinet minister named Erwin Kotler, very influential, well-respected international jurist, has done a lot of work in Israel as well as in Canada. And part of the work that this organization did was to try to push the Canadian Parliament and Canadian society more generally to accept the idea that any singling out of the state of Israel should be considered to be anti-Semitic because of the quote-unquote special place that Israel holds in the world. But we can already see what the consequences of that have been over like the last 10 or 15 years, where in the last month, people have been petrified, like the person asking this question, but also just the simple fact that like the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation cannot refer to like Palestinian people. You know, they have to talk about Hamas. They have to talk about this. I mean, does it even make sense that we're talking about Israel's war against Hamas when Hamas is not a state? Israel is a state, and Israel, even during the ceasefire, continues to fight in the West Bank now. So, you know, like the way that we are conflating what a state is and what a state isn't, and what the obligations of a state are vis-a-vis non-state, I think these details, they can seem academic, but then we see what the kind of social consequence of them are in practice, and we have like all this kind of self-censorship happening too. You know, like many of us have been trying to organize, many people very successfully, other people less successfully, just trying to advocate for a ceasefire. And the difficulty is associated with even trying to call for peace because of this kind of imagined special state status that Israel should hold, is causing a lot of people to self-censor. It has caused even more people to lose their jobs, journalists losing their jobs for taking a position that seemed to be overly critical of Israel. I think now this is what's happening with Israel, but the same kind of principles, I think, are being studied by other states that want to make similar kinds of claims. And here I'm thinking about India. I've got India in the crosshairs on this one because a term that I've been hearing a lot more of in the last couple of years is this idea of Hindu phobia, right? And I say this as a Hindu and part of the global Hindu diaspora, that when I see the kind of overlap in strategies between Israel and India, and I see the kind of like discourse emerging out of like Indian social media kind of championing the rights of Israel to defend itself, but not necessarily talking about Palestinians, we see a really major shift. And it's it's a significant thing that has global implications, because now this idea of Hindu phobia is kind of latching on to this space created and co-opting, I think, very legitimate things like anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, which has had a global significance for a really long time, and is seeking to center something that is like largely not happening. You know, like it's not like there's no Hindu phobia at a structural level happening in a place like India. I understand this question is not about India, and it is about Israel. So before I pass it back, I guess I would just summarize by saying, in my opinion, no, states are not people. They should not be treated like people, even though everyone is leading us to believe that they ought to be treated like people. To be anti-Semitic is to be hateful against Jewish people and the Jewish religion, but definitely not a nation state, which is something altogether legally and territorially different. Alex?
All right, on to the next question, which continues this thread. I read in the Globe and Mail that a tenured professor at York was arrested for participating in a protest against chapters. Meanwhile, other university departments are being taken to court because they've taken positions that are pro-Palestine. What is happening to academic freedom in this country? So, good question. Full disclosure, I think it's fair to say, I know the professor in question. She is a friend of mine, so and a collaborator and other things, although it was news to me that she'd been arrested too. So I guess I'll just say that, given that I wish her only the best, and think that yeah, that certainly the allegations that have been brought by Toronto police that this was in any way hate motivated are incredibly ridiculous and just an attempt to do what AJ was just talking about, which is to frighten people out of speaking out. Like, at the same time, I've got to say, I find the invocation of academic freedom in this case, like, is just spurious, man. Like, I don't get to go out into society and do whatever I want and claim academic freedom. Like, the people who've been charged, you know, they went to a chapters in the middle of the night. They you know, engaged in what might be called like corporate property destruction or damage, you know, put up posters, threw around paint, that kind of stuff. That's not protected by academic freedom. Like, and like, on this note, I've got to say, I wish people would stop making these arguments. It frankly bugs the shit out of me when white collar professionals try to demand that their institutions back them on their politics. I have never expected that from my institution. I don't think my institution should support or denounce my anti-capitalism, my pro-feminism, my settler decolonial practice. You know, I think it's incumbent on my institution not to censor me. And within my teaching and research practice, I have academic freedom as an expert in my area, but not to say whatever shit I want. Like, people need to think about this. I saw something in like one of the people expressing strong solidarity again with the accused in this case from York, and I forget her name. It's one of the professors who's organizing solidarity, said something to the effect of, York should protect us, or our institution should protect us in our capacity as activists. Like, I mean, where do we draw the line on that is what I would say. Like, if there are white supremacist activists, would you want your organization or institution to extend the similar rights to them? And it's kind of maybe easy for us to say, well, of course not those people, but then who gets to make that call, right? It's easy when it's organizations we like. I wish full support, full solidarity. I express my complete solidarity with the accused, and especially with the professor in question. I think this is ridiculous. I think it's at worst, it's mischief and vandalism. It's a strong political statement, but no, like, I don't think this has anything to do with academic freedom. And like, as you can see, like, it upsets me. Like, only the professional managerial class thinks their professional institutions ought to stand up and defend. Like, nobody works at McDonald's is like, I went to a protest and threw paint on shit and, like, you know, like obstructed an entrance, and McDonald's has to stand up for me, or Needs, or Wilson's Gas. And, you know, like, only academics are like, I should be protected. I shouldn't have to. Like, part of activism involves risk, and I know for a fact the professor in question understands that. I think that's why she's been so clear. Her and her co-accused have been totally clear that this has nothing to do with hate. To come back to what AJ was just saying, like, they criticize chapters because the founders, the owners and founders of chapters, are high-profile backers of an international scholarship that basically encourages Jewish people without any family in Israel to move to Israel and join the IDF and then live there, right? So it's like kind of a global crusade, a global Zionist crusade to recruit soldiers for the IDF and to pay their way. Like, that's what they were responding to. And they said, you know, chapters like your book purchases here basically fund genocide, which is a strong claim. And I'm not going to weigh in on that. It's the right of people to make that claim. And that's the conversation we're having. It's obviously not hateful. It's not wrong to accuse a corporation of contributing demonstrably to policies that we object to, and to identify that. Now, the work of that group in engaging in extra legal activity to cause trouble at that store is a different question. It's just like, it doesn't, the academic freedom just doesn't extend to that. And I say that as a department chair, as somebody who's like worked on bargaining committee, like, you know, your union contract doesn't protect you from doing anything, right? Like, just like this idea that tenure is somehow a job for life, that's also not true. Professors who don't do their work, who run afoul of the law, can be fired. Of course you can be. So enough with this stuff around like the professoriate being this special class. I mean, there are entitlements here, don't get me wrong, but I don't think this is a question of academic freedom. I do think it's a question of like an extremely overzealous application of the law that will never hold up in court. Like, hate crime legislation is incredibly difficult to meet the test of. There's a reason for that. Some of those reasons are good, some of those reasons are bad. But in this case, there's no way that anything in the propaganda the activists handed out in any way remotely meets that test. But they're doing it to scare the shit out of people, right? To make sure people understand that this kind of activism will be viciously prosecuted and result in like social censure. And that's what the accused have pointed out. That's what they've said already. They've said, this is ridiculous. This is an attempt to silence people. What we want is a just peace between Israelis and Palestinians. What we're calling attention to is the fact that there are all kinds of interests that are like directly working against that, actually, which is a pro-humane, anti-hate message, not a hateful one. So I think that's a huge, total solidarity. There should be no charges. There should be no court case. I don't agree with any of that. Obviously, they knew what they were doing. The activists, whoever they are, whether they've got the right people or not, they knew what they were doing when they threw paint on a store. Like, whether we like it or not, that stuff is illegal in society. It's like minor property damage. It's like really, you know, like whatever. So surely that can be resolved in a different way. But none of this, like, relating back to hatefulness or to hate speech or anything like that. I would make that distinct from the issue of whether York was right to suspend the 3 workers who allegedly participated. Given that the charges have yet to be proven in court, these people have the rights that all Canadians have. We are presumed innocent until proven guilty. The prof has been suspended with pay, but without the right to finish her semester's worth of courses, obviously, which I think is that's a ridiculous overreaction. The administration responding to pressure. It is an attack on the reputation of that person and her standing in the community, for sure. And I wish the university had not taken that action, but I also don't think, like, again, and this is like something we can parse in other episodes, maybe if people want to follow up on that. But I am like, just like, it bugs me. It bugs me when we're like, the institution doing the institution. We should, like, it's like the same thing. I don't want, like, an odious speaker is coming to my university who I totally disagree with. I am all for making a person's life on campus uncomfortable and difficult. That's my democratic right. But I would not go to the administration and say, deplatform this person, they ought not to speak on campus. Now, you folks might feel differently, but I am not interested in invoking the power in that institution in order to arrive at it that I think is a good one, in part because I think, like, that's precisely the world we don't want. We don't want to cede more and more moral and actual authority to the powerful. It reinforces all those awful dynamics. And I think York should say, listen, these people have been charged. They can continue. They obviously should continue to work. People have the right to are innocent until they're proven guilty. That's all we're saying about it. Nobody's asking York to endorse it or not, but their condemnation of it is the problem. Suspension of their workers is the problem. That's certainly a problem. What's happened to academic freedom across Canada? Oh my goodness knows. Like, that's a whole episode we could run on this. There are lots of double standards. There's lots of contradiction. But again, I'd say, like, when you invoke academic freedom, like, you have to be aware it's not a political right. We're invoking like a professional expertise related right to speak, teach, and research on the basis of your expertise. So I don't have academic freedom to spout whatever nonsense I want to on campus. I have academic freedom around the areas that I'm an expert in anthropology, social movements, politics, that kind of stuff. And it doesn't give me entitlements. That's a peer-reviewed system. So I know this sounds boring, but like in part, I think we live in a better world when we get material realities, the things we're confronting, rather than opining the abstract injustice of it all. But I get it, and I think the charges are ridiculous. This is a guru court, and this is meant to scare people for sure. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. I think that's really useful clarity, actually, about the limits of what academic freedom covers, what it doesn't. I don't know the person in question, so I don't know if, for example, Middle Eastern politics is an area that they know about, and I do think that might make it different, and I'll explain why I think that through my own experience. So and how different the reactions were. So I didn't know a lot about this until we got the question, and while Alex was talking, I pulled up an article in the Toronto Star published very recently. So I was just reading about what happened, and there's a lot of it that's really kind of like startling. So for example, the colleague, our colleague at York, apparently wasn't arrested at the time, but had her door kicked in and broken, and was arrested and handcuffed in her bed with her partner. Like that sounds like a bloody raid. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, in the realm of like how people can connect with academics and professors, you don't generally need to break down their doors in the middle of the night and cuff them. That's, we're pretty easy to find. And especially when we are talking publicly, like, it would have been enough to probably call them or like turn up and say, hey, come with me, you're under arrest, or we need to talk to you, or what have you. That they didn't do that is obviously a sign of what they already think and the prejudice that goes into this particular issue. And I think then what also kind of like dovetails into what we were talking about earlier in terms of, when it comes to criticism about Israel, people assume a separate standard. And I'll use my own example. A couple of years ago, I was teaching a class in development activism, and my students were tasked with, creating relationships with Mi'kmaq water protectors and their allies. And, long story, I actually published an article about this that you can look up called Solidarity is Not a Verb. But what was different about this is that my university administration totally in that time did not support what I was doing. The university president's lawyer called my chair to complain. I had to make a case about my academic freedom and why it was important for me to take my students down to what at one level of understanding was private corporate property, right? The Alton Gas private property. And then I had to explain to them that actually it's unceded Mi'kmaq territory, and that this is like a fundamental part of the academic experience of understanding what colonization and land theft is and how it's operating. So there was a really strong, I think, intellectual position about I cannot do my job as an academic if I cannot take these students to this disputed territory to support, the work that Indigenous people and their allies were doing. It was like an hour and a half long conversation, and it did not lead to the lawyer saying, "Oh, go ahead, Dr. Parasram. We think that's a great idea." What it did do was kind of like, I accept that this is within the purview of your academic freedom. I don't like this, and I can't guarantee what's going to happen. So kind of to Alex's point, academic freedom it's like a discursive process. It's like a negotiation. It's something that you have to defend and fight for. And I think it needs to be fought for. So the RCMP did not kick down my door, but they did do lots of other things. They started turning up at my office and leaving business cards and trying to convey through intimidation that they should have a role to play in coming and educating my students about what is lawful and what isn't. And there's a quote in this article here about the incident that happened with the York professor that I think is worth reading. And this is a quote from a guy named Dean. I don't think he is a dean. I think his name is just Dean Lavey, who's the director of Hillel York. And the quote is, "The professors and administrators, if they're teaching students and young adults how to behave, then they need to show a level of professionalism in their life. Committing an act of vandalism, if that is what they did, is illegal. And someone who did something illegal should not be teaching students. So this is a point that I really fundamentally disagree with. It is not our job as professors, scholars, teachers, researchers to teach anybody how to behave. You're all, like, our students are adults. They know how to behave and they know how to make decisions that have consequences. We're not teaching behavior. We're teaching politics. We're teaching how to exist in the world. And this kind of like idea that the law is fundamentally just and should be adhered to no matter what is a dangerous one to try to hang your hat on, because almost inevitably everything that was awful was lawful. And it's only through the deliberate breaking of laws and engaging in demonstrations. The whole history of, like, you know, civil disobedience tells us that you cannot be disciplined by that which is lawful. And I think all should be suspicious of this. And it was obviously a complete overstep by the Toronto police to treat our colleague in this way. They should not have been arrested. They should not have been, or at least they should not have been arrested in that way. And I think Alex's point is compelling. The person understood what was at risk and they were engaging in work as an activist in that sense. But certainly their employer had no business suspending them. And I also read a separate thing here that said no students are going to be like harmed in this process. It's the end of term, folks. If you just get rid of your prof, they're not, like, how are you going to finish that class? What's going on with their exams? And instead you got somebody who's not been charged or found guilty of anything sitting around at home and not allowed on the campus that they work at. I mean, there's a lot of double standards and confusion happening here, and we should not kind of be blind to that.
Yeah.
Okay, Alex, back to you.
Yeah, great point. I guess like the one that, because I hadn't heard that quote, AJ, that you just used, but I think this is such an important point. Once again, this like kind of gets back to brass tacks in our society. You know, that whole thing about like where our legal tradition comes from almost 1,000 years ago, Magna Carta, blah, blah, blah. Well, the whole principle of that is that actually, if you did commit a crime, even a bad one, and you paid your time, you did your time, then it's not supposed to be held against you for the rest of your life. Like, what is this idea that if somebody broke like any law, like I jaywalked and I got for it, I got a couple of speeding tickets. I admit to that. Got busted by the popo. Should I not be teaching students because
Right.
I have speed? Like, I mean, just that idea that somebody, somebody did something that violated a law, and so therefore they should never be allowed in proximity to young people. I mean, for goodness sakes, like, what kind of world do you think you live in, my man? Like, anyway, okay, so like, yeah, and I think, this is the point. Like, however you feel about academic freedom, the principle is that, and in her, like, indeed, if these people, if they've got the right people, and I think there's ample reason for us not to necessarily fall. Like, how do we know? We don't know. Police make mistakes all the time. So what if these people are in fact innocent? And we're busy, like, this is why we have a court system. Ostensibly, it's why why we're supposed to reserve our judgment. So yeah, penalizing people by removing them from their positions is not justice, right? It's scare tactics for sure. On to the next question, which follows in a similar theme again. Okay. Sorry, I tabbed down too quickly. Jonathan K. tweeted that a university prof asked a question about Israel pinkwashing as a way to undermine Palestinian liberation and suggested that the prof should be reprimanded. Without more context, it seems like the prof arbitrarily picked on Israel in this case. Should that be allowed? So, good question. Thanks for asking it. So pinkwashing, for those of you who don't know, is an act of trying to sanitize or, cleanse or whitewash, some odious practice, structural inequality, by presenting it as socially just in another way. So in this context, and Israel is actually quite famous for this, for promoting its tolerance of queer lifestyle, sexuality, and for like identifying itself as like a tolerant place in this bastion of like Arab like hatred of queer people and all this kind of nonsense, right? Suggesting that basically, once again, you know, this whole notion that, like AJ was talking about before, that Israel is a person, and as a person, it's a really friendly, tolerant person in the Middle East that's really democratic, and everybody else around it, all those other people with their swarthy skin and their weird head coverings, are all the barbarians, right? That's like essentially what's going on. And actually, where we live in Kichipuktuk and Halifax a few years ago, there was a big thing around Halifax Pride, because Israel, like the tourism board of Israel was always prominent there. Part of the Pride supporters gave a lot of money to Pride, advertised, and it became like a matter of real tension within the Pride organizing here, and a lot of people at the grassroots brought that issue forward. There was an incredible fight around it. And I'm not telling people how to feel about it. You know, I'm not even going to go on and say I think that the Israeli government or is being insincere in its inclusivity, or that it's not really willing to tolerate different sexualities and gender identities. I don't know, and I don't actually care. What is clear to me is that in using one issue and trying to draw tourism, certain kind of tourist dollars to, let's be clear, this is a very, like our like poor queer people traveling to Israel on holiday, are like trans people traveling, are like, two-spirited indigenous people. No, I mean, it tends to be well-heeled, upper middle class and above white folks who are, some of whom are queer identified, who are being like invited to and travel to Israel, right? That's like tourists everywhere, right? So this isn't some like broad-based, please, like everybody come and experience Israel. It's tourism. It's like, come spend your tourist bucks. This is a fun place to party. And we're really tolerant of your lifestyle, unlike other places in the region. So I think without that context, yeah, it seems arbitrary, but actually there's good reason to point this out. It's like when Canada grandstands about our history of like advocating for human rights. Meanwhile, there are all these indigenous communities all across the country without potable water and right? Like, people aren't wrong to say that Canada is engaging in a form of whitewashing around that to basically excuse the ongoing denial of sovereignty and dignity to indigenous nations, while trying to trumpet its human rights record in other ways. So that contradiction is totally valid. I mean, it's like when you identify a key contradiction in policy that allows you to make the case why something is unjust. So no, I think Jonathan Kay is, he's a provocateur. He's one of these carefully coiffed and cultivated right-wing pundits who likes to make a lot of noise over this kind of stuff. And I think Kay is demonstrably wrong. Many people have written about this. Again, Israel is not the only country to do it, for sure, but they are notable. Just like calling themselves a democracy in, amidst all this Arab backwardness, is also a position to take that allows you to sort of position yourself in a morally superior position with respect to your enemies, your opponents. So this is like, we're here to civilize the brutes. We're here to show them the way. You should support us. We care about gay people. I find it entirely unconvincing and insincere. And I think it's, again, it's not to, like, I don't doubt that queer people probably live okay lives in Israel. I'm sure, like many places in the so-called global north, that Israel has its own problems with homophobia, transphobia, and queerphobia. I don't think it's a perfect place even for people who are regarded as being like a key part of the society. But I certainly think internationally, those campaigns are meant to sanitize those issues and are meant to sweep them under the rug. So No, I don't think that academic was wrong. I think that's a decent point to make, and I think Kay is cherry picking and trying to delegitimate Palestinian resistance and solidarity with it by playing that card. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I don't really have a whole lot to add to that. Not knowing the details of the situation, I mean, assume like it seems like it's a topical issue, and the only thing I would say, is if folks still aren't convinced or are looking for extra justification, I encourage you to look up Queers for Palestine. This group has, have made some of the most, like, I think, poignant statements about precisely the pinkwashing issue and precisely about why you can't hide behind like that disposition and use that as a blunt object to protect yourself from criticism. So I was just trying to find the statement online here while Alex was talking, but I didn't succeed in finding it. But look up Queers for Palestine. They have an absolutely beautiful solidarity statement that explains this a lot better than I could. I think we can get one more question in, Alex.
All right, let's do it. Pardon me, sorry. Interested to hear your thoughts on Hamas. Everyone seems to be condemning them, saying they're evil, etc. But isn't Hamas the one group actively doing something for Palestinian liberation? Are they as bad as everyone says, or is that just white settler colonialism talking? Great question. And I'm going to say, like, I am certainly no expert on Middle East politics broadly. That's not where my academic specialization comes in. But I will say this. Hamas won democratic elections in Gaza to form, the representative government of the Palestinian people there. Yes, the Palestinian Authority formally governs in the West Bank. The PA is widely regarded, again, as a non-expert, rightly and wrongly, perhaps, as compromised, as complicit, as kind of like the comprador class meant to sort of suppress Palestinian resistance and statehood. Whether that's always a fair critique, I won't get into. I think there's a lot of internal politics here that aren't for me to adjudicate. But I don't think Hamas is evil. I think, like I said before, I would say that I think that resistance always needs to be understood in context, and we can disagree with strategies and tactics in any particular instance. And I would, I'll go on the record as saying, I think, intentionally targeting civilians, whether it's by a first world formal military or by irregular units, like guerrilla armies, is immoral. I don't know how else to say it. I think, the taking of hostages, it's not that I don't understand why, and you're just asking for my opinion. This is not authorization to engage in a war against a whole people based on the tactics of a group, right? So yeah, Palestine isn't coextensive with any group of Palestinians or any community, let alone with any political organization. There are other political organizations on the ground, and any one of those could be a legitimate one. The thing that I would say is, if people are horrified by Hamas, let me tell you about the IDF. I also say that resistance is bred by domination, right? So if you want to ask, if we really want to get into this kind of ridiculous chicken and the egg argument, which people seem to endlessly want to do, and say, well, okay, so October the 7th, I would agree, was atrocious. And I'm just not gonna carry water for that shit anymore. I'm too old, too grumpy, too many blows to the head through all my martial arts stuff. I'm too cranky for it. But I would say, holy cow, history didn't start on October 7th, right? So how about we go back? How about we go back a decade or, more to Israel's occupation and brutal suppression of Palestinian activism in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Let's go back to talk about how Israel's campaigns that have eliminated and the intifadas in the past, which were not violent, but were demonstrations of civil disobedience and unrest on the part of Palestinians, organizing in the most noble of traditions, I would say, in terms of asserting themselves and demanding justice and dignity, and being met with like live ammunition, Israeli torture tables, like all of the stuff associated with the modern militarized occupying state. So like, I just, you know, both acts of violence are atrocious and deplorable. The difference is that on the one hand, you have you have 3 million people squashed into this tiny territory, unable to leave, literally, like no entrances or exits that they can access themselves, no access to water, to electricity, to food that Israel doesn't allow in. No ability to speak politically in a way that's regarded as legitimate on the international stage because they're denied a state. You know, all these kinds of things, and then subject to this brutal, ongoing, invisibilizing occupation, which doesn't lead to any kind of just peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And then ask the question why, like, groups of young people, especially young men, growing up in those conditions, watching, young people die of totally treatable, curable illness, watching elders waste away, watching like people with no hope, no upward mobility, no belief in a better future, why they would turn to violence. Oh, gee, I couldn't even imagine. You know, like we don't have to celebrate them as heroes to understand how those awful conditions would generate a resistance that is equal to the occupation. So I would say if you hate Hamas, if you see Hamas as evil, then you need to see the occupation as equally evil and constitutive of that resistance. So we're engaged in like a dialogue or even a dialectical struggle where these forces are reconstituting each other. It's true. And what we need is not more war, not more bloodshed, but we need a capacity to compel real negotiation committed to an enduring and just peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I'm not going to go on the record right here and say what I think that looks like because I don't live there. It's not my job to say that. It's not my right to claim that. But I would say that's my take on Hamas. And I think it's incredibly difficult right now to have this conversation in a sensible way. So thank you for that question. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex, and thanks for this. It's a great question to end our conversation on today. I think at the core of it, we should spend a little bit of time thinking about what terrorism is, right? And I forget if we might have covered this shortly after the attack started. But anyway, it's worth reiterating. Terrorism is a tactic. It's not a state of being. It's a tactic whose definition is essentially acts of violence that target civilians for the explicit purpose of achieving a political objective aimed at frightening people into a particular kind of action, right? And with that definition, absolutely, October 7th was an example of a terrorist strike. But like Alex has explained, it didn't happen in a vacuum. History doesn't start in October the 7th. As to whether or not Hamas is, the one group doing something for Palestinian liberation, I think Palestinians are organizing comprehensively for their liberation, and they always have been. And Hamas is one actor amongst many other actors. They're an important one, and I would recommend people read the book Decolonizing Palestine by my pal Samdeep Sen. Part of what is interesting in that book is that he describes how there's a wide range of views within Gaza about Hamas, and of course there would be. Does 100% of people in Canada support the liberal government? You're not going to support by virtue of being a government, particularly a government of a non-state, right? I'm coming back to the state aspect here. It's a very different dynamic, and what Sam argues in his book is that Palestinian resistance has to be simultaneously a post-colonial project and an anti-colonial project because of the particularities of what life in Gaza is actually like. So the post-colonial aspect are things like, trying to run a government, trying to organize food and medicine and that sort of thing amongst constant occupation and violence. And then the kind of anti-colonial part, for those of you who've read Fanon and others, this kind of rehabilitatory part of the, returning of a sense of autonomy and agency over one's actions, And that might take the form of violence in some sense, or retaliatory violence. It's a very different and nuanced perspective. Read Som's book; it's useful in that. Or, I mean, even better, just listen to Palestinians who explain this. All like the Palestinians are all over Twitter explaining this really eloquently. Yeah, so you can find it there. But the other thing I would add here too, then, is on the subject of terrorism. Because terrorism is not a state of being, but rather a tactic that can be deployed, we have to be honest and in terms of having a conversation about what terrorism is, and ask, why is it that the charge of terrorism is only ever applied to non-state actors? You know, because if it is a tactic, then it is a tactic that is also deployed by states. Because as a weapon of the weak, for lack of a better term, of course it's going to be deployed by non-state actors who don't have the benefit of states to support them. But what you need to understand is that states engage in terrorism. Like, states act for the strict, what is the definition? Acts of violence that target civilians for the purpose of achieving a political objective. As far as I'm concerned, from observing what the state of Israel has been doing in the non-state of the Gaza Strip since October the 8th, we'll say, has been an effort, like just one example of state terrorism after the next. Nobody, well, it's not that nobody's been saying that, but no government has been willing to say that. And, you know, if we're being honest, then we have to say that the state of Israel, as well as Hamas, can engage in acts of terrorism. Just like we would have to honestly look back at history and admit that George Washington, the founder of the American nation, was a terrorist who was leading a terrorist insurgency against the British government that had established itself as a legitimate state in that time. You know, General Dyer in India was a terrorist who, you know, went and mowed down all kinds of innocent people to strike fear in the hearts of the Indian people for seeking freedom. Lots of people, both at the head of states, both at the head of armies, both in counterinsurgencies, engage in this, you know, deplorable act of military strategy. But we don't do ourselves any favor by getting into the moralistic, you know, the essence of this is that there's nothing, because honestly, if like Hamas was gone tomorrow, there would be another organization that would be forced because of the structures of what's happening to take on that role anyway. You know, like, and you can check with the Palestinian scholars who have been writing endlessly about this, about the Intifada, take you all the way through. But if we want to talk about terrorism, I'm happy to talk about, you know, Hamas strategy as engaging in terrorism, but not until we're willing to put Israel on the table too. Then we can call, as they say, a spade a spade. But until that, we have to acknowledge the propaganda war that's basically happening here. And that's not, you know, I'm not like picking sides. I'm trying to be an empirical international relations scholar who studies conflict, which is what I'm trained to do and should be covered by academic freedom in order to do that. So that's the kind of conversation that we should be having. I think all Palestinians everywhere are fighting for Palestine, and some of them are in Hamas and some of them are not. Don't let the kind of discursive aspect of what is and isn't terrorism get in the way. That's all for me. Yeah, I guess that's all that we have for this month. Thanks very much for your wonderful questions and thoughtful questions. Obviously, there's a thread running through here that is very significant to everyone. So yeah, join us again. We'll be back next month, and I really hope that there will not be an ongoing war for us to talk about then.
Imagine.
See you later.
Thanks for signing us off, AJ. Yes, and wonderful comment to finish with. Like, remember, like, get back to that material, lived reality, right? Like, stop fighting about abstract ideas. People deserve lives with dignity, and like nobody more than the folks who have been living at the cutting edges of these shitty systems for the longest time.